Hello, and welcome to the Science on 7th live stream, a virtual space where we talk about topics related to air quality and health. I'm your host, Pallavi Pant, and this is our final live stream of the year. It's been a very interesting year for air quality. Earlier this year, we released our State of Global Air report. If we can pull up the graphic showing that millions around the world are getting exposed to air pollution, and as a result, we see a really huge burden on health, especially in low and middle income countries. At the same time, we also saw that countries around the world are taking action, cities around the world are taking action. We saw a World Health Organization roadmap on air pollution get adopted by countries. We saw political declarations on NCDs, non communicable diseases, mention air pollution as a key risk factor. And we saw also multiple countries launching new air quality management plans, strengthening their air quality standards, or thinking about sectoral actions that can lead to improvements in air quality. But in all of this, one issue that continues to come up is the need for regional cooperation and coordination and the need for global cooperation. We are experiencing in parts of South Asia right now really high levels of air pollution. And as we know, this is an issue that transcends borders. Pollution never stops at a boundary, at a geographical or a political border. So we wanted to use today's time to talk a little bit about transboundary air pollution and why we really need this global cooperation, regional cooperation around air quality. I'm very excited to have two wonderful guests. One of them is joining us live today. The other one spoke with us due to time zone differences earlier, so we will be playing her responses. But first, let me welcome Stefan Åström, who is the managing director of Anthesis in Sweden and is currently also co-chairing the Forum on International Cooperation on Air Pollution. He's worked on a range of topics related to economics, air pollution, and climate change for over 2 decades now, and has focused his efforts on international policy. So we're really excited to have him here. He's looked at emissions reductions options, how to think about costs and benefits, and for the last a few years has been thinking about how to take lessons from regional air pollution treaties and think about global applications. So welcome, Stefan. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. We will also be hearing from Helena Varkkey, who is an associate professor of environmental politics at the University of Malaysia. She also has a long-standing experience in transboundary haze governance, especially in Southeast Asia, and has done a lot of field work. She's published books and articles on the topic of transboundary air pollution. So we're really excited to also have her perspective on this topic. And if any of you listening in have questions for Stefan, please put them in the chat and we will try and get to them if we have time. But Stefan, let me get going. And I'm going to start with a simple question, which can become really charged depending on where you are.
Yeah.
What's the air quality currently where you're sitting?
Of course, I had to look it up. And the weather is so bad outside that today I would prefer to talk about indoor pollution, but I won't. I know we actually have a bit bad for Gothenburg, the city I'm in, levels. The PM 2.5 levels are actually 26 micrograms. And I know that's an insult level for some of this audience, but I want to emphasize that in the 70s, it wasn't like that. We have done enormous amounts of effort to reduce our pollution levels. When I was a kid, there used to be some clear winter days. There used to be a thick blanket when you drove down to the city that you had to go under to go into the city with the inversion effect or whatever toxic stuff that was. I don't even remember, but we have done a lot to clean our air. So now today is bad, and then it's 26. And I know that's way lower than annual average for other countries. And on annual average, I think that we are around below 10, honestly. So it's doable. I can tell you that. It is doable.
Yeah, that is actually a really wonderful message to be starting on, that, air pollution is a problem that we have solved in many places, or, addressed to a large extent in many places. And I think, since we are talking about transboundary air pollution, and you mentioned like earlier times, I know that even in Europe, transboundary air pollution has been an issue for a long time.
Yeah.
But we know there's no political boundaries, geographic boundaries when it comes to air pollution's impacts. How relevant do you see transboundary cooperation being in terms of addressing air pollution, in terms of air pollution action versus, what
Mm.
countries or cities might do on their own?
I do. This is one of those questions where I really try to get stakeholders, researchers, and decision makers to understand that even in a large polluted city, so much of the pollution comes from outside the city borders. And we have, I mean, for Sweden, there are some pollutants, it's only 10% of the air pollution for some pollutants are coming from Swedish sources. The last numbers I have are basically that, well, for fine particulate matter that we speak a lot about in this context, Southeast Asia and South Asia, the secondary PM 2.5, I mean, only secondary, it's only a quarter that comes from Sweden. And for the primary emissions, it's only half. So it's so important for a country like Sweden. And again, we have oceans around most of our borders. So it's not that we are next door to a very polluting place, but again, transpounder air pollution, it also crosses oceans, at least the small one we have next to us in Sweden. So getting the message to regions that they can collaborate between regions to get it into effect, it's important for me. Also getting cities to understand that they, even though they cannot write a law to mitigate emissions in a neighboring city, they can still collaborate because they will still benefit from the same problems and the same solutions. And also by this collaboration, and this then comes the next part, you can save money because you can think about where is it most cost effective to reduce emissions? Where do we get the most health effect from emissions? And at least when I speak to those who are not born and raised in the air pollution community, there is a tendency that people think of air pollution as we should think of greenhouse gases. But the greenhouse gases are so well mixed. They go into the atmosphere and then they mix around. But these air pollutants are not well mixed. They can go from one country directly to another, but missing the neighboring country. So it's so region specific that we cannot think of it as a global well mixed thing. We have to take into account where the sources are and where the effects are. But also, I think it's another cooperation area which I personally like is the development of knowledge and know-how and the sharing of technologies, because there has been so many advances done in different parts of the world, in different parts of the regions, and there's so much for us to learn there from each other on how to reduce emissions, how to create trust between institutions, how to govern so that a municipality can cooperate with a county that can cooperate with a larger region and so on. That's a challenge. And to get different parties and different, all those things. And yeah, so it's a plethora, if you like. It's so many things we can cooperate on, and we are really trying to get that to happen now. So that was a long rambling, but I will stop there.
No, I think that was, it was interesting, that the various aspects you mentioned, because it also highlights how important it is to think about air quality action and governance as really interdisciplinary, because
Mm.
scientists and technologists aren't going to solve the problem by themselves, and neither can the policy experts. So we really need everybody to be working together. We also asked Helena this question, since this is a focus of her work. So let's hear what she had to say about the need for transboundary cooperation. If we can play the video now.
Coordination is actually really important because in our part of the world, both the causes and the effect of the pollution is not localized in one country. So not only the effects, so the effects is pretty much well understood. You have haze coming from one country, but it travels across the region because of the wind patterns and stuff like that. But in the case of this region, the causes are also transboundary. So what I mean by that is the economic drivers, where we have companies who are based in, let's say, Malaysia or Singapore, and they have their plantations in, let's say, Indonesia, and the plantations are affecting the land use over there, and that's resulting in fires which cause the haze. And the haze then comes back to places like Malaysia and Singapore. So the coordination of the causes really needs to be transboundary as well. So it's not just about the effects, but it's the coordination from the very beginning of the story, the causes itself. So because of that, coordination is needed across all stages, prevention, preparation, emergency response, and not only coordination in terms of activity, but also in terms of governance, in terms of politics, in terms of perceptions and public awareness and all that. It all needs to be transboundary in nature.
It was actually fascinating. A lot of times when we talk about air pollution, and I'm sure you've come across this, we tend to focus on sources and what is emitting the pollution. So it was very interesting to me that Helena was also talking about the economic drivers and where they may be situated vis-a-vis where the impacts are. So we asked her, to tell us a little bit more about this too. Especially for folks who may not be very familiar with how this works in Southeast Asia, or even know about the haze problem there, which has been really pertinent for a long time. So let's hear from her about the major sources and then the drivers, as she was just referring to, for regional haze. Can we play the video, please?
Countries of Southeast Asia suffer from some sort of haze. And if you want to divide it up, you would have the northern Southeast Asia and the southern Southeast Asia, where the drivers are related but slightly different. They are all mostly related to agriculture. In the north, which is the Mekong region, most of the agriculture there is on mineral soil. So the burning occurs after every cycle, after every planting cycle. So crops like maize, sugarcane, rice, and the transboundary context here is there are a lot of transnational companies. I think most of them are based in Thailand, but then they are also having activities in the Golden Triangle area. So for northern Southeast Asia, the mineral soils, it's more frequent as well because the cycle is more shorter. And you would have like even hills on fire during that time. But for southern Southeast Asia, where I'm based in Malaysia, the land use change that is related to fires is a bit different. It's not mineral soil, it's on peatlands. And peatlands are traditionally wet or damp. And usually peatlands don't catch fire very easily. What happens is when there is land use change on these areas where the water is drained away, the land is cleared and dried for commercial plantations. And these plantations usually can be palm oil, can be pulpwood, and even other smaller scale crops like pineapples, for example. When the water is drained away, peatlands become very dry very quickly. And because peatlands are so carbon rich, peatlands are actually a good storage of carbon when they are kept pristine. As soon as they are drained, actually all this carbon gets released into the atmosphere. And because it's very carbon rich, it is very fire prone as well. So fires very easily start on these lands. So in the past, there used to be much more intentional fires because fires used to be a cheap and quick way to clear the land. Sometimes this still happens, but because of the awareness and people are being more educated about this, companies and what do you call this, farmers are more careful about that. But the fact that these plantations are still on sensitive peatlands, it means that the fire risk is just much higher. And when there is a fire in one area, the likelihood for fires to return are even higher as well. So because of that, these disturbed areas in the peatlands, they very easily catch fire year after year during the dry season. And this is what causes the haze. And the haze from peatlands are actually, I would say, much more severe in the sense that it's really carbon-rich fires, and you can imagine biomass fires. They are very thick, very black, smoky fires that are very hardy. So when they do travel across the region, they really last for a long time.
It's interesting to hear her talk about these fires, because I also want to come back to you, starting with fires. So this year, the fires in Canada and also, the fires in Siberia had an impact on air quality in Europe. And there were very vivid images of how the transport of that pollution is happening. And at the same time, we know, and you also mentioned this, that over the last several decades, we have seen really amazing progress towards clean air, not just in Sweden, but actually across Europe. And there has been wonderful collaboration between Europe and North America in particular through the UNECE Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution. So can you tell us a little bit about, how this convention even came about, what led to it, and then what kinds of success and what kinds of progress have we seen over time?
Yeah, thank you. I really liked her answer. It was always interesting to learn more about. I didn't think of all the peatlands they have over there. We do have peatlands in Sweden as well, of course, but they are also a mess to put out once they've started to burn. I know
Very
that.
true.
But back to your question, no, the Air Convention basically started out, was spawned in the 70s, and had to do with the fact that we used a lot of coal power in Europe at the time, and the oil we used was very rich in sulfur. So it turned out that there was so much of it that it actually acidified our lakes and rivers in parts of Europe. And quite a few North Europeans could see their rivers and lakes being drained of fish. So the animals were dying, and something was clearly wrong. And after some conferences and meetings and discussions and public pressure, of course, this UNECE Air Convention was born in 1979. So it's the first international environmental agreement. Of course, 1979 was how should we put this? In North America and Europe, and then Soviet Union, it was a place of much conflict. It was the Cold War, as we call it. I've understood that in India it's called something else, but in Europe we call it the Cold War. So the Soviet Union and the North Americans realized that they needed someplace they could talk without disobeying the fact that weren't allowed to talk according to diplomatic routines. So then environmental issues turned out to be a fairly neutral topic. It wasn't political. Air pollution affects Soviet Union the same way it affects North America. So that had something to do with it for sure. It also gave a lot of attention to this. It's a way to allow people to talk. And the successes, we would argue, is fantastic in some cases. For SO2, the sulfur dioxide, that is the main driver of acidification and polluting rivers and lakes. We have reduced emissions by, let's say, around 95% since the peak pollution period in Europe in the late 70s, early 80s. Of course, not everything has been due to air convention protocols and so on, but at least a 40%, 40% of it comes from active engagement in pollution management, and international agreements have been very important drivers of this. So that's one of those first topics of concern, and also then naturally the first topic where we can say that we have now succeeded to a very large extent. There are now even reports of rivers and lakes where fish is naturally by itself wandering back in. So it's repopulating again, which is spectacular when you think about it. And now the latest advances, I think, is that we've been able to merge our environmental concerns related to acidification, human health, and eutrophication, and also ozone damages into one policy arena. So in Europe now, we are working with at least 5 pollutants at the same time, and we try to consider all those health and environmental effects that I mentioned when we try to think about new policies. Currently, we had a first protocol like that in 99 that gave pollution reduction, and then we followed up in 2012, and we are actually right now still ongoing, or we are still discussing whether we can set or whether we should set stricter targets for the future. But we are still moving in the right way. And again, that's an area where we must not confuse air pollution with climate change, because yes, the climate change challenge is enormous and it's huge, and we are not moving in the right way. But with air pollution, we actually are. So it's not granted that an environmental problem that is of international nature don't go the right way. The air pollution challenge does go in the right way still. The emissions are not going up in Europe. And we have had air quality similar to many of the cities that we are talking about in this context. So it's definitely two successful stories I think are worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's actually, thank you for sharing that perspective. And it's always, wonderful to hear about areas where we have made progress. And I think a few years ago, there was an article about this convention which said this is the most successful air pollution treaty that you've never heard of, which is so true. Like we don't, I think we haven't really celebrated how much success at the global scale. Of course, it would be a different conversation if we're thinking just about Europe. But a lot of times when we are, in South Asia, we also look at the ASEAN region where there has been longstanding efforts to think about transboundary cooperation on air pollution, and we tend to think about that as being a blueprint for where South Asia could potentially go, given the significant geopolitical challenges we have, the very, very transboundary nature of air pollution, the similarity of sources. So we also asked Helena this question about how that process evolved and what led to the levels of cooperation that we've seen. So let's play her response and see what she thinks helped the ASEAN countries come together.
Haze affects so many Southeast Asian countries. It was really quite straightforward for ASEAN to step in and try and, manage this problem. So actually, haze, the conversation about haze at the regional level started from as early as the 1980s. But if you want to talk about sort of landmark or notable mechanisms that is active in ASEAN, of course, the ASEAN Haze Agreement would be the big landmark agreement. This was in early 2000s, and this was notable because it actually managed to get all countries on board, the countries that were suffering from haze and also the few countries that were not. And all the countries signed and ratified, even though the ratification took a bit of time. Actually, the agreement was signed in 2002, but it was only 2014 that there was full signatories it's full ratification, with Indonesia coming on only in 2014. So this caused a bit of delay because Indonesia, of course, was a very important part of this whole conversation. The ASEAN Haze Agreement is legally binding, and that's also notable for ASEAN region, which is generally does not favor legally binding agreements. However, there are limitations to this. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's no dispute resolution mechanism. So it's limited because of the negotiation process and also because of the sensitivities, the political sensitivities that were involved during the whole process, because it involves source countries, it involves victim countries. There was quite a bit of pointing fingers, some countries not liked being viewed as the perpetrator or the source. So because of all this, it was a bit watered down. Sometimes it has been called a paper tiger. So a lack of enforcement and lack of dispute resolution. However, it did put into place a few really good or vital processes. For example, the regular COP meetings, the steering committee meetings, and this was really good for coordination. Haze is is an annual problem because of how the weather patterns are, and the annual meetings of these signatories did help with coordination to quite a bit of an extent. However, there was a lot of things in the ASEAN Haze Agreement that was not yet actually, in terms of operationalization, it was not really that well spelled out in the agreement. And to address that, ASEAN actually had several roadmaps. So the first roadmap came a bit later in the 2020s, and this roadmap, in the 2010s, and this roadmap was actually, the idea was to operationalize some of the things in the ASEAN Haze Agreement which were not fully operationalized yet. So things like the ASEAN Haze Coordinating Center, the panels of experts, all these were mentioned in the agreement but not fully operationalized. So the roadmap came into play to try and push these things forward. Some things were able to be pushed forward to a certain extent. For example, the Haze Coordinating Center was operationalized through the ASEAN Secretariat, but actually it was supposed to have been a standalone center, because currently the ASEAN Environmental Division at the Secretariat is kind of handling it, but the Environment Division is handling a lot of other things as well. So ideally, it would actually be a separate thing by itself. And the second roadmap for a haze-free ASEAN, which is the active one right now, is actually looking into that whole process of setting up actual standalone coordinating center to just make sure everything is much more coordinated. The final thing that I want to talk about in the whole ASEAN governance ecosystem for haze is the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center. So this is a meteorological center that is based in Singapore. And this center was at quite the early days of coordination already set up. And it was meant as a regional center to monitor and assess land and forest fires, and also importantly, provide early warnings on haze. So this was really important because not all countries in Southeast Asia had an equal level of maturity in their meteorological services. So this was meant to help the countries which were not so advanced to actually have some information so that they could handle the problem when it arrives. However, there are limitations as well, of course. The role of the Specialized Meteorological Center is a bit unclear, and sometimes the validity of its reports or are questioned or are challenged by national centers, because each country also has their meteorological center. And when the data doesn't match up, this actually becomes problematic, and it becomes fuel for political debates. And, this can actually slow down actual action on haze. And all this working together, as I said, there has been some good things coming out of it, some progress, but there are also limitations. One thing that I would like to highlight, which I think is something that should be priority, not only for this part of the world, but also in other areas, is the importance of a uniform or a regional level approach to monitoring, to air quality indicators and all that. So even though ASEAN has been handling haze for a long time, for many decades, there's still not really a uniform approach to monitoring and air quality indicators. There's no ASEAN standard of air quality indicators. So what would happen is the numbers, they don't really match up. For example, in Singapore, it may show that it's unhealthy, but when we look at, let's say, Johor Bahru, which is in Malaysia, just across the causeway, it may have something very different, but it's very close together. So this also shows a lack of uniformity in understanding the problem in the region. And also it becomes a problem when the people of the countries view this, and then they become confused and they become unsure of what message or what actions that they should take in response to haze. So these are some of the things that ASEAN has done and some of the things that I think ASEAN is still working on. But I hope eventually, as you say, ASEAN is really, I would say, kind of pioneering in this. But of course, as any pioneer, there will be teething issues. And I think ASEAN also has a lot to learn from other parts of the world as well.
That was a fascinating walkthrough of what's sort of happened, and I actually have a couple of follow-ups, just also in the case of LERTAP, because there has been significant scientific progress made in terms of our understanding on air pollution and the mechanisms, and I'm curious how you sort of see that process and the role that the scientific cooperation and its relevance in the decision making or the policy actions that were taken. And secondly, just for the audiences, is LERTAP also legally binding, similar to the agreement in ASEAN, or is it set up differently?
So the first one, I would argue that there is what we call a science policy interface, where the scientists involved in the Air Convention have always been, let's say, invested in improving air quality, in their case by using their scientific expertise. But for that, then they also appreciate or maybe even need input from the policymakers. Which questions do the policymakers need answers to? And then the scientist needs to figure out a scientific way to answer those questions. And so it has been a back and forth. And of course, sometimes the scientists also highlight an area of concern where they think that there might be something going on here. For example, with air pollution and human health. That wasn't much talked about in Europe and in North America in the 70s and 80s. But then finally, some environmental medicine experts, epidemiologists, were able to show very convincing correlations between air pollution and human mortality. And all of a sudden, they could show this, and then that gained a momentum. Then the policymakers became more concerned and realized that they needed to ask new questions to the scientists, and so on and so forth. The last one that came in was the climate change effect of air pollution. So that's also back and forth here between science and policymakers, which is really what we think a success factor. At least we can say that without the knowledge we have today, scientific knowledge we have today, we wouldn't have been able to implement the protocols and the ambition level we also have today in air pollution related issues. So that I think has been a very important part. And on the legally binding aspect of the LERTAP Convention, it is legally binding in the way that the countries implement them in their own national laws. So in contrast to the European Union, for example, where some of those laws are EU laws and the countries has to abide to an EU law, in this case, the implementation goes via the national governments. Mainly. So the LERTAP cannot hand out fines to a country that doesn't reach the protocol. But it comes into national legislation. That's a part of the agreement between the countries.
I'm really glad to, sort of hear you talk a little bit about the science policy interface, because this is also something that, comes up in a lot of conversations where if the science is happening in its own silos, it may not be as relevant for policymaking. And in the last few years, we've been seeing, more and more news about the transboundary air pollution problem. I think we have a few screen grabs if we can pull them up. And I think in the context of knowing that we have these examples that have been successful to various degrees, LERTAP, or even the work that has happened in ASEAN, it's a great time to have the Forum for International Cooperation on Air Pollution. We had the Helena resolution recently that called for greater regional cooperation. And the goal for this forum, as I understand it at least, is to facilitate exchange of information and mutual learning. And I think there's a lot of lessons and sort of best practices that can be adopted. So as the co-chair for this forum, where do you see some opportunities for both regional cooperation and also global cooperation and learning and exchange.
So I can talk about this one forever, but I'm also aware that we might be a little bit over time. So I will stick to two ones that pops up to my mind right now. And knowledge sharing on science and on emission reduction solutions, perfect example where Europeans can say that, yeah, we tested this and this and this solution. Do you think that could work? Or we can collaborate and say that, well, we both have problems with pollution coming from individual households, from wood stoves. Can we cooperate on that? Because we don't know in Europe how to solve that, and we don't know in Kenya how to solve that either. Is there a solution there? There are humans involved, so it's at least some general point. We also can cooperate on sharing information about the different types of policy instruments or legal techniques we use to implement these emission reductions. When we have tried so many different ways, when speaking to some Indian experts a while ago, I heard about a policy solution that I've never heard about in Europe. So there are so many fantastic developments going on across the globe that we need to share with each other to see if we can effectively find ways forward in terms of putting the measures into law, enforcing them, making them happen. There's so much knowledge there. There's so much innovation going on in that space too, which needs to be shared. Those two are the ones I'm going to stick to today. And if you talk to me tomorrow, I'm sure there are going to be two others, but those would be the ones that are top of mind today.
I really like your point, especially about trying to find commonalities across regions and then trying to fix some of those problems. You've been active in the air quality space for a while now, and I think you've already given us some examples of success stories or changes that you've seen. But if I can ask you for one thing that gives you hope in that clean air future that we all want, what would that be?
But two things that gives me hope, rather. One is that we have proof of concept. We have already cities and regions and countries that have been severely polluted that are no longer polluted. Period. That's the situation. So we know that we can do things that will work. Okay, that's one part of it. And then I must say that having as FICAP co-chair, I have talked to many and been around on various places. And I must say that the level of engagement by civil society and experts, engagement in fixing this problem also in other regions of the world, I think is very inspiring. Because of course, you need the drive from the people involved and the youth organizations that have been so vocal and active on this. Those two aspects, basically, that's almost all the hope we need. No, so it is doable, and I've seen much engagement around the world. So those are the two things that gives me hope.
I think that those are beautiful messages to be, ending both this conversation on, but also since this is the last live stream for the year on, indeed, I fully agree with you. There's so much that we have achieved in terms of improvements in air quality, and there's just great momentum that hopefully we can continue into 2026 and beyond. Thank you so much, Stefan, for being with us today, and also Helena, who spoke with us earlier. And we look forward to continuing the engagement, and we look forward to your leadership and FICAP and other forums. Everyone listening in, thank you very, very much for joining today and for all previous episodes as well. We're going to be back now in February next year. We really hope you have a wonderful, joyful, festive season. Take care of yourselves and have a happy, happy new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.